morning. Welcome to our session, Agriculture on the Front Line, What the World Can Learn from African Scientists. This session was meant to be a hybrid session. We were meant to bring Jackie Opara from Nigeria, Ivan from Kenya, and Chinwe from Nigeria, but unfortunately, because of COVID, the Italian visa office seems to be closed, and we haven't been able to bring any of the speakers here, so we've had to move the session to virtual only. So my job is simply to introduce our moderator, Jackie Opara. Jackie, go ahead.
All right, thank you everyone. Welcome to our session. It promises to be exciting, and I hope you learn one or two things from what African scientists have been doing, especially in terms of agriculture and climate change. You know, African farmers and researchers are front climate change, and the world can learn from their experiences. That is the theme of our session today. Climate change and agriculture are two sides of the coin, and they both take place on a global scale. Climate change, as you know, is already affecting agriculture, whether it's through changes in temperature and rainfall, shifts in pests and diseases, waning nutrition quality of foods, or loss of agricultural lands due to sea level rise. Our panel today will give a platform to key thinkers in agricultural research and policy from across Sub-Saharan Africa. We have Ivan from Kenya. Ivan is the senior scientist, invasive species management at CABI, the parent company of SciDev.net. He's an entomologist by training, and his research focuses on the development of climate resilience. He employs balanced basic and applied research to unravel invasion biology and ecology. Then we have Ivan is going to speak on invasive species and climate change. There's a lot to be learned from his speech, and it's quite informative. Then we have Praise. We have Chinwe. Chinwe is going to be our first speaker today. She's a climate change specialist, and she's also a livestock development officer with the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development in Nigeria, and currently part of the team that is working on the federal government initiative for climate action transparency. She's a registered animal scientist and a member of the Nigerian Institute of Animal Sciences. Chinwe will speak on the effects of climate change on livestock production in Nigeria. Our third speaker today will be Praise. Praise has a background in soil science and a master's degree in environmental leadership, and is currently undertaking a PhD program in environmental science. So his experience in project design and climate change mainstream, having worked on international projects in West Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Africa. Praise believes that the health of the environment is a responsibility for everyone. He will speak on the effects of climate change on rice production. So for this, I'm going to hand over the mic to Chinwe. Chinwe is going to be our first speaker today. Chinwe, can we hear your presentation?
Good morning, everybody. And it's a privilege to be talking on climate change and how it affects livestock production in Nigeria today in this conference. And I know generally, normally, when we hear about climate change, most times we often liken it to just crop production. And a number of times, researchers don't know that livestock production is also adversely affected by climate change. And that is basically what we'll be looking at today. And then also be looking at how the Nigerian farmers, some of the things they've been doing to mitigate, and some of the evidence practices they've been handling, they've been using to combat climate change in Nigeria. So we'll be looking at what the world can learn from African scientists from livestock production in Nigeria. And in the presentation, looking at the contributions of livestock farming to climate change, and then the impact of climate change on livestock production. Because looking at the evidence of climate change and livestock production in Nigeria, and the resilience model for. Hello, can you hear me? And finally, giving a recommendation from livestock production in Africa. And agriculture, according to FAO, is known that animal agriculture is responsible for approximately 18% or 1/5 of the human-induced greenhouse gases. And you know that in every step that is involved in livestock production, all the value chains involved in livestock production, greenhouse gases have always been emitted into the atmosphere in every of those steps. And the livestock sector equally plays an important role in global gas emissions. And with the way the population is increasing, we are expected to increase production in order to still be able to meet up with the food security in the at least by 2050. And now that is where the challenge lies for livestock production. How do we increase production without also causing another significant increase in climate change, or without adding to what's already there in climate change? And that's what we're looking at. So we're looking at the contributions of livestock farming to agriculture. Now, the major contributions of livestock farming to climate change is through the production of methane and nitrous oxides. And methane from livestock production is gotten from enteric fermentation and also from the storage of manure. And enteric fermentation, that's what happens in the rumen of ruminants, is one of the major contributions of methane to climate change. And the high incidence of methane in the environment is one of the major contributing factors that leads to climate change. Then the second is nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is gotten from manure storage, and then also through the use of organic and inorganic fertilizer. Then the other way through which livestock contributes to climate change is also through food processing. That all the various steps that are involved in food processing, both from the planting, fertilizer application, to all the other transportation, food processing, from the planting until when it gets to the animal, all these things have a contribution in it to the climate change. Then we look at the impact of climate change on livestock. Now, due to the variations, the climatic variations, all these things affect livestock production. Sorry. Then we're looking at the heat stress and other stressor impacts on livestock production. We're looking at emerging diseases and vector redistribution. Now, look at deforestation. Deforestation, which is a result of deforestation causes habitat loss, and deforestation is associated with climate change and global warming. And deforestation has led to an increase in proximity of different animals to human communities, therefore resulting in increased contact time and the risk of genetic disease spread. And secondly, when we look at heat stress and other stressor impacts on livestock production, in this looking at the heat stress has actually been associated with a considerable reduction in feed intake, body weight, growth, development. Heat stress also results in drop in milk production, the quality of milk produced, even reproductive efficiencies, it also affects their susceptibility to infections and diseases, and the attendant impact on production and the cost of production generally. All this potentially threatens to impoverish farmers that rely on their productions as a source of income and sustenance, thereby posing a threat to Nigerian food security and safety. Also, the impact of drought and reduced rainfall also inadvertently affects the available grazing pasture. And these, along with the other impact of flooding in some regions in Nigeria, then gully erosions in some other areas, and then they all have contributed towards the reduction in crop production, harvest quality, and the residual feedstock from integrated crop livestock farm, while also creating grain scarcity, and therefore also inciting malnutrition as an additional stressor. And when there is grain scarcity, the animals are unable to feed properly, and this equally affects the production of livestock. We are still on the impact of climate change on livestock. Then also another impact of climate change on livestock in Nigeria is also communal conflict. Looking at this way, the biting impact of drought and reduced rainfall and the forage actually resulted in the extension of grazing periods of most or nomadic herdsmen in some other regions. And now because of this, usually there is migration. Animals, the nomadic herdsmen move with the animals in search of greener pastures. That's from areas where drought has been largely affected. There is migration to the other areas that have that still has better pasture for the animals, and this leads to clashes between the herdsmen and the settlers. That's the settlers, I mean, that's farmers whose crops are usually damaged by the grazing pattern. So, and these are migrating paths usually result in communal clashes between them, and also high death tolls, and the poor health conditions and displacement of people in the affected regions. Now, next I'm looking at the evidence of climate change and livestock production in Nigeria. Now, what are the things that we've seen that made us know that yes, we're already living with climate change, or this is already happening in the livestock sector in Nigeria? We're having, just like earlier discussed, we're already having more disease and vector redistribution, that we're having more disease available now. And then secondly, we are also having migrations from livestock that are well known to be abundant in some regions before the whole influence of climate change, and now being easily seen in 20 other regions, not just on the regions where they are majorly found, because of migration and because they're also looking for better pastures. And another evidence of climate change, that we're probably having high cost of livestock production. And this is high cost of livestock production comes as a result of scarcity in feed for animals, and then because of the climatic variations that affect production, that affect water availability, and that affect some things, all these things indirectly affect livestock production. Now, because of that, we are having fish stress affecting the production of animals. Their production efficiency has been dropped because of fish stress, and we're having reproductive deficiencies. These animals are not performing as they ought to perform. They're not, or as they have been performing before. And this also affects the output. Now we're having reduction in egg production. We're also even having reduction in meat and meat production. Then sometimes also the quality of what is produced is also affected. Now, all this also affects because all this leads to high cost of livestock production. Then another evidence is communal clash, just like mentioned in the impact. In Nigeria here, we are having a lot of communal clashes due to the Fulani herdsmen movement with their cattle. So a lot of communities are fighting because they're trying to protect their farmland from destruction by the livestock. And we're looking at the livestock production in Nigeria and integrated pest management. Now, normally infectious diseases in animals and their transmission cycles is usually a complex interaction between host pathogens and then the environment. And due to climate change, pest infestation has also affected livestock production. In particular, prolonged drought that determines water and pasture shortage, and which equally decreases livestock immunity against infectious diseases, and as well trigger livestock movements in areas at higher risk of animal diseases. Also, this movement also results in conservation of domestic animals around very few available watering points and grazing areas in proximity to wildlife reserves. And the risk here is that this disease transmission is increased by increased contact among domestic animals and also between domestic and wild animals. And then grazing areas also resulting from deforestation and changes in land use also exposes livestock to pathogens due to increased interface between the livestock and the wildlife. Then we also look at the vector-borne diseases that are usually strongly associated with vector amplification due to climate change variability. Some of them include we have trypanosomosis in Nigeria, Livestock, and then these are some of these are some of the other diseases that affect livestock in Nigeria as a result. Some of them have actually been heightened as a result of the climate change. We're having food and mouth disease incidents, we're having anthrax, we're having trypanosomosis, and then the tongue and the Rift Valley fever. Trypanosomosis is actually strongly influenced by global warming and the rise in temperature. Then we have the other one, anthrax, is a soil-borne disease. They are usually affected by precipitation variability. And livestock and wildlife likely get infected with this anthrax while they are grazing, and sometimes they ingest forage or soil contaminated with anthrax spores while grazing, or while browsing on vegetation that are contaminated by the iron flies. Now, livestock resilience in Nigeria. These are some of the ways, activities that protect livestock farmers in Nigeria. We have waste management. Grazing management, we're looking at rotational grazing. Now, instead of leaving animals on a particular land for them to overgraze an area, normally it's advisable that the rotational grazing is practiced. After they graze on an area, then they are moved to another area for grazing. this movement allows the grazed area to be able to regrow more and be ready for next batch of grazing. Then matching animal numbers to change in pasture. Then we also have agroforestry. Agroforestry that provides shade for animals, improves the feed quality, and pasture management and nutrition, improving food quality around through feed processing, like chopping, urea treatment, grinding, that's before being fed to animals. Then we also looked at the improved pasture species, such as the grass and the legumes, and then the forest mix. And another resilient model for livestock farmers in Nigeria is equally through animal breeding. As breeding animals that are able to adapt to higher temperatures, that are hardy, that can able to adapt to the climate changes in the country. Then pest and disease control, feeding strategies, vaccinations, then early warning signs, insurance, land-based system, that reduction in enteric methane emissions, improved food digestibility, and then carbon dioxide removal through carbon sequestration. Then the role of the private sector in mitigating against climate change. Now, what are the roles of the private, or what are the private sectors, what can they do, or what are they doing to help livestock farmers adapt to climate change in Nigeria? Now, looking at private sector, we have the micro, the small, and the medium enterprises. Then we'll have the large scale and the multinational corporations. Then we'll have the capital providers and the market facilitators. And the micro and the small medium enterprise will have the small scale farmers, the local companies, we have the small entrepreneurs. All these come under all these make up the micro and the small and medium enterprise. And now, what are their roles, or what can they do? What have they been doing to help with climate change? First of all, what we have to do as a micro and small and medium enterprise, first of all, they themselves, they have to adapt to climate change. By adapting to climate change, they have to adapt their own operations and access to climate change. That is, they have to ensure business continuity. They're able to protect those that depend on their private job and infrastructure. So they have to, first of all, adapt to climate change. Now, for the large enterprise and the multinational corporations, in this place we have the big companies, the large companies that they are usually very active in the country. Then they have large potential players, and how do they, or what is their role in mitigating and adapting to climate change in Nigeria? They support other players through products and services for resilience. Here we have some major big farms, major big organizations and companies. Now, they support other players by they provide irrigation facilities. They also can help and provide the animal breeding services. We also have the ones that provide they provide the training to livestock farmers on the better reproductive technologies and the management practices in the farms. Then we have the weather observation technologies, climate change early warning systems. All these come under the large enterprise and the multinational corporations. Um, Probably we're looking at the capital providers and the market facilitators. These ones belong, they are normally, majorly what they do is they finance climate change adaptation. And how do they do that? Okay, in this we have insurance companies, the banks, and investors. And they finance climate change adaptation by providing loans, micro loans, capital to farmers. Now we have climate smart livestock production. When we talk of climate smart livestock production, we're talking about how can we increase livestock production without degenerating the environment more. What are the positive ways we could actually increase livestock production while also protecting the environment? Having to be looking at in climate smart livestock production. Now we'll be looking at it. First of all, we have to consider the grazing management. We look at the grazing management, look at pasture management and nutrition. We look at agroforestry, look at animal breeding, we look at animal and herd management, disease control and feeding strategies. Then we also look at early warning systems and insurance. Now looking at grazing management, then in that area, better grazing. Now we have grazing can actually be optimized by have to find the right balance among the different users of land and adapting grazing practices accordingly. One of these strategies for increasing efficiency of grazing management is through rotational grazing. That's the frequency and timing of grazing is adjusted to actually match the livestock needs with the availability of pastoral resources. Then there are also two targeted temporal grazing exclusions. Rotational grazing allows for maintenance of forage at a relatively early growth stage. Then in a colder climate where the animals are housed during cold periods, there is also opportunity for controlling the timing of grazing in order to avoid grassland degradation and adapt grazing to the timing of vegetation growth in order to optimize their intake. Then animal genetics, animal health, manure management. Because of time, I'm going to look at the practical recommendations from livestock production in Africa. And these are some of the ways that livestock farmers in Africa have been able to overcome or mitigate climate change. Now we're having breeding for higher temperature tolerance. We're having self-organization by livestock farmers. They group themselves in groups in order to be able to access insurance from financial corporations. Then we're also having establishment of grazing reserves in various regions in the country. Then we have a lot of public-private collaborations in livestock production and management training. Then we also have physical modifications of farms, farmers cooperatives, and then livestock farmers have actually now they have been able to understand the importance of insuring their livestock, and thereby we're having a lot of livestock farmers insuring their farms. And some other recommendations that can be considered include enteric fermentation. We can look at how we can manipulate the diet of animals, be able to reduce the amount of methane that is being produce from insect fermentation. Then we could also consider vaccinations, additives, then animal genetic selections, increasing the concentrate feeding or a balance between forage and concentrate feeding. Then physical processing of forage, chopping, grinding, stream treatment, all these have been said to help to reduce the formation of methane from insect fermentation. Then also forage harvesting at early stage in order to reduce lignification. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chinwe. Thank you, Chinwe, for that. If anyone has a question, we can all gather it around until after all the speakers have spoken. So, can Praise please come up with your own questions? Come up with your own presentation. Sorry, Praise.
Chinwa is still sharing. Am I live? Oh, okay. Good morning, everyone. This morning, I will make an attempt to discuss with talking points the problems that we've encountered in Africa, and then I'm zoning in on rice production in Nigeria. Rice is a staple food in Nigeria, and Nigerian farmers have been able to build some level of adaptive capacity. And in less than 10 slides, I will be able to look at what we've done, and then also look at what we can also do. Okay, it's no longer news that more than 60% of the population in Sub-Saharan Africa are farmers. And so as such, one would expect that the issues around farmers and what affects them would be at the front burner, and such issue is climate change. Now, if you look at rice production, the two major issues around that affect yield and quality of rice production are increase in temperature and then precipitation, that is rainfall. Others include shifts in pests and diseases, because for rice weevil, these insects that have they produce eggs. If you have an increase in temperature, it could either delay or exacerbate their production, and then it will always cause problems for farmers. Other issues include problem with nutrition, poor nutrition, quality of nutrition in foods, and then also the loss of agricultural lands due to sea level rises. Now, rice is grown in the coastal areas, especially of Nigeria. However, there are other rice varieties grown in the upper in the land region. For this presentation, we'll be looking at both, and then we'll be looking at these issues that I've mentioned. We'll look at climate actions. What are the lessons learned? And then we'll look at some recommendations. Now, like I said, increase in temperature and rainfall are one of the most issues that affect rice production, especially as it concerns yield and quality of the grains. Now, rice will normally, the optimum temperature for rice production lie between 22 degrees and 31 degrees. Anything above this would hamper the growth and the production of rice. In towns like Mina and Yola, which are in northern Nigeria, some days you record temperatures as high as 40 degrees Celsius. And these areas are rice belts of the country. And rice is a staple food in Nigeria. So which means if there's a reduction in production, then hunger sets in. Now, while rice is a water-loving crop, excess water also increases the likelihood of diseases and a whole lot of other issues. Now, studies reveal that 1% in rainfall could lead to 22.2 increase in yield, while 1% increase in minimum temperature could lead to 3.7 reduction in yield rice production. Now, when it comes to pests and diseases, like I said, the life cycle of an insect, it will go through different stages. Now, take for instance, one of the pests that usually affects rice production are birds. When birds, we know that birds migrate a lot according to how the weather is. And so when the weather is not right, when the climate is wrong, then you see birds migrating from where the harsh conditions are, and then they come either north or south of the country. And this, since rice is growing in the north and also in the south, when there's that migration, it's either that the north is suffering or the south is suffering. I'll take one example to discuss the second point, which is the nutrition quality of foods. One popular food Nigerians love to eat is the jollof rice. The standard jollof rice would have rice, vegetables, protein, all it takes to have a balanced diet. But at some time in the year, if some of these additives to the menu are not available because of drought issues or flood issues, you see that the consumer or the farmer is left with just to consume carbohydrate without the additives. Now, this is just an example that a Nigerian would relate to. The third is the loss of agricultural lands due to sea level rises. Now in Nigeria, since 2012, states like Delta State, Kogi State, which is a confluence state where River Benue and River Niger meet, have always recorded flood every year from 2012. And the rice growers in these states that I've mentioned are just around the bank of the river because they want to get water for their crops all year round. And each time this happens, farms are flooded, houses are flooded, and we see that it affects the price of rice in the market. Currently, because of the population of Nigeria, which is about 200 million persons, rice has been banned from being imported, and farmers are encouraged to grow rice. However, whenever these issues come up, there's a drop in the production level of rice. Now, what actions are we taking? One is integrated pest management. One of the crops that we see that's available in Nigeria is the neem tree. The neem tree has a lot of persons have been able to produce organic products from the neem tree that have been used to combat pests and diseases affecting rice. And it is not as expensive as inorganic solutions. So we are seeing an increase in the adoption of organic materials to combat pests and diseases. Now, the second one is the resilience models for smallholder farmers. One thing I think that we can learn from Nigerian farmers and also in Africa is the fact that farmers work in clusters. And working in clusters reduce the amount of money they spend to purchase inputs and also land development. Because we have issues with land fragmentation and land tenure system, we are now seeing a situation where farmers come together, pool resources together, and develop land, get inputs together, grow. And when they grow together, it makes the off-taker interested in buying back this product. And so we are seeing that for farmers who are not faced with who have not faced issues with rise in temperature and precipitation, they are getting more money from the products. Now, what is the role that the private sector is playing? We know that for any business to thrive, you have to have engagement of private sector. You have to have that inclusion. And so, for the rice value chain, we're beginning to see private companies like Olam partner with um, national projects and international funded projects to serve as off-takers. And to do this, they are able to encourage the farmers with leasing of land, aggregation of inputs, and support them with off-taking. And the truth is, they also do this at the market prevailing price. So the farmer is not shortchanged because the private sector is involved. Yes, we have this notion that whenever the private sector is involved, they usually want to maximize profit at all costs. But in this case, we are seeing a level playing field, and this is making sure that there's no side selling, and then farmers smile back home at the end of the day. Now, the promise of conservation agriculture. Conservation agriculture, things like agroforestry, ecology, and so on, have a huge impact they are playing. I once visited a farmer in Ondo State, and he took me to his farm. Because he could not find land around where every other person has. He actually went into the forest and cleared a portion for himself. And I visited it, and it was a nice sight to see. Now, these farmers, one way they've built their resilience is this same farmer told me, because I had to ask him, how do you know that the rains are here? Because he lives quite a distance from the farm. And so he told me that there is a bird that would usually fly across. And when he sees the birds, he knows that the bird is coming from a region where it's raining and is trying to escape to a region where there's no rain. And so we're seeing that these farmers are harvesting local knowledge, and they're applying it to production of a crop rice. Now, what are some recommendations? Number one is this: from donor-funded projects, especially in Nigeria, we've seen a case where the project design does not happen outside the project location, which means that the farmers, the beneficiaries are consulted, they are part of the process of project design, they contribute to the components of the project, and this makes it easy for them to own the project once the project comes online. The second is indigenous knowledge. Yes, the donor funders funded projects are not at scale, which is a huge challenge, because considering the population of farmers we have in Nigeria, we see that there's a lot of potential if most of these projects are scaled. There's a lot to learn from farmers if one could harvest their indigenous knowledge and how they've been able to build their adaptive capacity. We'll see that a lot will change. The third is they've been able to group themselves. This is one good recommendation, because if the farmers stay apart, then they might be spending more on inputs, mechanization, and so forth. The fourth is promotion of small farm implements. Because we have a problem with land tenure system and land fragmentation, instead of buying or purchasing huge farm machinery, which impact the soil. We have issues with soil compaction and so on, soil heartburn. We've seen a process where farmers now come together and purchase very small farm implements, not the hoe and the cutlass anymore, but motorized equipment, implements that help them because most of them do not have above 2 hectares of land. So with these small implements, we've seen that the turnaround time for production has improved, and so has yield also improved. Right now, 3-4 years ago, we used to see a situation that a hectare of rice in Nigeria would produce 2.2 tons per hectare. But right now, it's between 5 and 6 tons per hectare. The last is solar-powered irrigation schemes. You would agree with me that you cannot successfully produce rice without irrigation and water resources available. And so in 6 states in Nigeria, I've been able to see where rice has been produced using solar-powered pumping machines, boreholes, and everything is solar-powered. Now, because these farmers are able to come together, then the cost of installing these equipment is so minimal that it does not affect their cost of production. So these are some of the recommendations I think I have seen personally from a lot of projects in Nigeria. Like I said, the skill is still very low, but these are lessons I think if we can take them to other places, they will make a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Blaise. That was quite informative. So I'll quickly move on to Alvan to share his own presentation.
Yes, good afternoon from Nairobi. My name is Ivan Romshana, and I'm going to take you through a talk about invasive species and climate change, which in my view is one of Africa's greatest 21st century challenge, and give you some insights on the kind of issues that African countries are dealing with when it comes to invasive species and how these are further exacerbated by climate change. But before we really go into depth about what invasive species are and the impact of climate change, we need to first have an understanding of what these invasive species are. A lot of the time there is some misunderstanding between what is an invasive and what is a native species that has all of a sudden become invasive. And so, I mean, when you try to define what an invasive alien species is, normally these are species that we classify as non-indigenous. They are pretty much not indigenous to the area in which they've been detected. And invasive species could be animals, plants, or diseases. And diseases include both plant and animal diseases. And these invasive species affect, a broad range of the economy in terms of the environment, in terms of the ecology, and the impacts are normally felt in the habitats where they have been introduced. Normally, the introduction can either be accidental or deliberate. Most of the time, it's accidental, but we are finding a lot of the time that in some instances, it's a deliberate introduction where an invasive was brought into an area for purposes of playing a certain role, and all of a sudden became invasive. And we humans sometimes play a role in spreading invasive species. Sometimes you do travel to various places across the globe and you come across a very nice or beautiful looking flower, and you think you can take that flower back to your country, not knowing that if that plant is in a new area where it is not native, within a short time or period of time, if it has no other natural enemies that can keep it in check, it becomes invasive. So all of us in some instances also do have a role we play in terms of invasive species that management and spread that we need to be worried about. One key thing about invasive species is that they can displace or damage native fauna and flora. They do pose serious threats to the local biodiversity, and quite a number of them have been known to cause adverse environmental, economic, or public health effects. So their impacts can be quite widespread and felt through various sectors of the economy. So why do they become invasive? That's the key question that we are asking. One of the reasons why this happens is that when an invasive enters into a new area, it lacks natural competitors. And so this allows it to become successful and resistant enough to survive in the invaded area. In a typical ecosystem, most insects and plants have other natural enemies that keep them in check, and it prevents the population from getting out of proportion. You can think of an environment like a national park where you have lions and you have zebras and all these and antelopes and all these prey that are living in a national park. Imagine if you were to remove the lion from the equation, the population of these other grass-eating animals would blow out of proportion because you don't have lions to keep them in check. And so the same scenario happens even in plant interactions and insect interactions, that normally in a typical ecosystem, the population of the different species is kept in check by another one. But if you happen to remove one from the system, then you cause an explosion. And subsequently, if you then moved one species from one environment to another where you don't have those natural enemies in the system, then it will become invasive. We have data that shows that Sub-Saharan Africa is highly susceptible to invasions by invasive alien species. And a paper published, I think, in 2018 showed that 11 of the top 20 countries at risk of invasive alien species actually based in Sub-Saharan Africa. So our region is quite prone and quite susceptible to invasions by invasive alien species. And over the years, we've seen a number of invasive species that have invaded Africa and become problematic. The recent ones are like fall armyworm. We now know it is all over the globe, all over the continent, causing serious havoc. And Africa is not only one affected, but it's now moved to Asia and Australia as well. So it has been quite rampant. We have papaya mealybug. We have the water hyacinth on water bodies. We have the tomato leaf miner that affects tomato production and a lot of other solanaceous plants. We have the Asian fruit fly that is quite devastating to mango and other fruits. Banana bunch virus, methylocrosis, banana xanthomonas wilt, all these continue to ravage Africa. So the list is quite endless when you try to go through into different countries and see what kind of invasive species are afflicting the countries. So this list can be as broad as you'd want it to be. And in Chino's presentation as well, she talked about emerging diseases of livestock and vectors that all continue to ravage the African continent. And subsequently, their consequences can be quite catastrophic, and a lot of African countries are grappling with the economic effects of these invasives invading their regions or their countries. So when you look at the data and what literature says, a study that was done recently has also shown that non-native species can threaten 73% of African countries. So the study covered 48 countries, and out of these 48 countries, 35% did say that they do have and do suffer from impacts of invasive alien species annually, which is quite significant if you try to think about, all the countries on the continent. This is quite a significant number. And if you spread out to the remaining African countries, I would like to think that the percentages will still remain high. A study was also done which looked at the economic losses from invasive alien species, and from just 5 invasive species, and in just 6 African countries, the losses were reaching up to 1.1 billion, and that is at a lower scale. It could go higher than this, but this was really at the lower scale. So you can imagine the kind of impacts if you now start adding up all the invasive species that afflict the continent and try to add up with the kind of impacts. I imagine that the kind of figures you'll get will be quite substantial. And when it comes to global losses, looking across all the various continents, we're talking about a figure of 70 billion per year. This is quite significant when you think of the kind of impacts that these invasive species cause. But of course, there are also other impacts that are not economic in nature. You can't quantify them like the way we are quantifying 1.1 billion or 70 billion. But when you think about biodiversity loss when it comes to extinction of species, the impacts can even be quite significant. This is something that normally is not well quantified, but certainly we do experience species extinction as a result of invasive species. So the impacts can be quite widespread and felt within various countries on the continent. And other impacts are the threat to food security and livelihoods. One key thing with African smallholder farming systems is that they are not resilient, and so the impacts are much more felt compared to other systems where the kind of farming systems are quite advanced and well developed and where they have better systems for controlling or dealing with such invasive species. So Africa suffers greatly because of the kind of farming systems that we have. And of course, impacts are on pasture production, on human and animal health. They can also affect water resources, for instance, the water hyacinth that affects electricity production on water bodies where they have dams or movement on water bodies, as well as fishing activities. It can be quite impactful. And also on fish, we do have some cases of invasive species that were introduced in water bodies. For example, in Lake Victoria, when the Nile perch was introduced into the lake, it has been feeding and causing extinction of other native species. So even impacts on fish can be felt when it comes to invasive species. And of course, invasive species reduce the resilience of natural habitats and aquaculture systems. So the impacts can be quite widespread. Now, when it comes to climate change, the question then is, what is the link between climate change and invasive species? And some of the points that I'm going to describe here, a few of them, Praise has mentioned them, but I can as well just clarify that a bit further. Because of climate change, we have longer seasons and warmer weather in Africa, and this ends up driving expansion and spread of invasive alien species. So as you have longer seasons and the weather becomes warmer, then the area in which invasive species could spread keeps on increasing. So you find a much wider area can now be invaded, and the impacts felt in a much wider scope of land. Some native species can also develop invasive traits due to climate change. They move to areas that they were not previously present and cause significant damage when they invade such areas. There can also be change in species hierarchies. So some species that may not have been dominant all of a sudden become invasive. And this is sometimes where the contrast between invasive alien species and native species also becomes a bit confusing, because you could initially have a native species that is not necessarily invasive, but because there's been a change in climate and it's able to move into an area where it could not initially move before, and where in that environment there's no natural enemy to keep it in check, it also eventually also becomes invasive. And of course, climate-induced stress in ecosystems also facilitates such invasive pathways. And we do know that climate change can also alter distribution and abundance of many invasive species, including increasing the ranges as well as establishment and impacts. And so the impacts can be quite widespread. So then the question is that what options does Africa have to deal with invasive alien species? CABI as an organization and partners have really been deliberating and trying to work out a mechanism and come up with ways of how Africa can cope with invasive species invasions and mitigate against the impacts that they have on the continent. And one of the ways that we think we could contribute is in terms of policies, where climate change policies can incorporate invasive alien species by including elements of prevention and control, and ensure that whatever measures we put in place to address climate change do not increase the threat of invasive species. And a classic example of where, a policy has actually led to an invasive situation is a case of Kenya and a little bit of Somalia, where a plant that is now invasive, Prosopis juliflora, was introduced in East Africa, in some parts of East Africa, to deal with desertification, issues of desertification. But because the plant is highly prolific and because it has no natural enemies that can feed on the pores and keep it in check, it did succeed to, of course, reduce on the impact of desertification by enabling areas to become greener. but it has now spread to other areas where it was not intended to spread, and is now invading cultivated lands and basically invading large grasslands and large cultivated lands and taking up land that could be used for pasture production and also agricultural production. So this is a typical case of where a policy that was trying to mitigate against climate change did not put into consideration the impacts of invasive species. Other options can be ensuring that measures to address climate change don't increase the threat of invasive alien species, basically what I've been describing. We could also think about incorporating climate change into risk assessments of invasive alien species. So as we are thinking about climate change mitigation measures, we think about how we can integrate invasive species assessments into such policies that we're coming up with, and enable us to identify those alien species that could become a future threat to our countries. We could also prioritize ecosystems according to their vulnerability to climate change to prevent introductions. So there are some ecosystems that are more resilient than others, and some are more vulnerable than others. And once we can do that prioritization, and then it can enable us to come up with methods or options that can enable us to better be able to mitigate against the impacts of climate change when we're dealing with invasive species management. We could also think about effective biosecurity measures, which we can look at in a way to manage those pathways that can introduce and of course bring invasive species into our countries. And this can be done through having robust early warning and rapid response systems that can tackle these species before they become invasive. So if this can be rapidly detected and dealt with before they become highly invasive, I think that can be one of the ways in which we can contribute to management of invasive species management through a climate change lens. We can also improve resilience of our ecosystems by prioritizing countries that are likely to be impacted most for control and eradication. So through that prioritization, we can, of course, know which countries are more at risk and those which are more resilient. And as we're coming up with programs, it can enable us to know where to focus our interventions first to prevent the impacts that are earlier described from becoming from affecting livelihoods and impacts and having those drastic impacts on farmers and smallholder communities in these countries. We also do know that invasive species are likely to become invasive due to climate change. And once we can identify these and eradicate or control them before they spread and become invasive, I think we can play a part in contributing to invasive species management, of course, keeping an eye on how climate change impacts on these species becoming invasive. And a key point that both Chinwe and Praise have highlighted is private sector engagement. I think one area that has not been well tackled is how to engage the various stakeholders that are prevalent or present in these countries in terms of invasive species management. The key thing to realize is that managing invasive species is not a one organization issue alone, but has to integrate a broad range of stakeholders. So it has to include government, it has to include private sector, it has to include civil society, and have all these various players engaging collectively to prevent and control invasive species and eradicate them. And so this is one thing that we need to continue imploring upon our countries to put in place or have systems that ensure that these various stakeholders can all engage and come together to all play a role in terms of managing invasive species. And this can result into more sustainable management of invasive species. And with that, I come to the end of my slide, and I look forward to questions and comments on how we can all play a role together in terms of dealing with invasive species that continue to afflict our continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alvan. I will hand over to Ben.
Thanks.
Hello, Ben.
Hi, Jackie. Thanks a lot. So just to start with, are there any questions from the room to any of our scientists? While we're waiting, I have a quick question for Ivan. About the hierarchy change, the species hierarchy change, can you give an example of the kind of species that can take control under climate change, and what can be done to tackle that?
Yeah, well, one of the species I could, give an example of is if you think about the citrus greening disease and the vectors that spread citrus greening disease, we have the Asian citrus psyllid and the African citrus psyllid, which is Triazaritri and Diaphanous citri. And what we are finding now, of course, before, citrus production was not, if you look at many countries in Africa where they produce citrus on a very large scale, initially, before you could, in order to avoid the citrus greening disease, you could actually go and produce, farmers were producing citrus in lowland areas because the African form of citrus greening and the vector could not go into the lowland areas. They're highly adapted to higher altitudes where the climate is cooler. But because of climate change, we're now finding that the scope of the African citrus psyllid is actually changing, and it's starting to move into areas which before it could not easily spread and transmit the citrus greening disease. So that's a typical example of where, because of climate change, a species that could initially not inhabit a certain area, a certain environmental scope within the same country and spread the citrus greening disease, it can now do so because there's been a certain shift in terms of warmer temperatures and ability of the vector to actually move into those environments and spread the disease.
Right. Thanks, Ivan. So if we have no questions from the room here, Jackie, do we have any questions online?
At this moment, we don't have any questions on the line. But there is a question for Praise here. Praise something on enlightening or more on the indigenous knowledge inclusion to improve adaptive capacity.
Okay, thank you. Where you need indigenous knowledge, in fact, the role it has to play is in the area of project design, because you want to find projects that make sense and can solve the problems of the beneficiaries. However, you need to also understand what is the existing problem and how the people have been coping with this problem. What coping mechanisms do they already have? So if you have this understanding, then you can either modify, build on it, or if the project has 3 or 4 project areas and one area is already coping with this well, you can share the knowledge across board such that when you're designing the project, then it's the dividends of the project go around. So that is one very good way. It has to do with project design. Thank you.
So there's a question for Chinwe here. Chinwe, the question is, how are Nigerian farmers adapting to climate change and what lessons can be learned from this? Chinwe, did you get that?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
So looking at climate change and livestock farmers, there are some things that the livestock farmers in Nigeria have been doing in order to adapt to climate change. And one of those is that we're having modifications of the farms, that are physical modifications of farms. Now, like poultry farms have been built there have been some physical modifications in the construction of poultry farms, for instance, where the farms are built on an elevated platform in such a way that when there's flooding, the penthouse is still safe and the animals are also still safe. Then there is also another modification where the houses are now being constructed higher in order to allow for proper ventilation just in order to reduce the heat stress and the effect it will have on the animals. Then the other way that Nigerian farmers have also been adapting to climate change is that they've also been coming together in cooperatives. And when they come together in cooperatives, they're able to access financial assistance from the financial institutions. Now, before some years back, Nigerian farmers don't even know about ensuring their production or ensuring their enterprise. They don't see the need to do that. But with climate change and a lot of information being training, and they are made to understand and see the importance of insurance. Now, most of them are now embracing and ensuring their enterprise in order to help them combat climate change. So when they have, just so that they can mitigate the losses they get from the adverse effects of climate change. Then we also have a lot of public-private collaborations. Now, we have some private collaborations. There's this very popular one. They call them Real People's Concept. It's a private organization in Nigeria. They work with the government and train farmers in a lot of livestock reproductive technologies just to help farmers with their reproduction. And also, they also train farmers in a lot of managerial practices to help them to manage for better management of their livestock. Then these are some of the ways that they also have the breeding. Although that is actually on a long term, a lot of work are also being done. And over time, we've had some animals that have been able to adapt to the increase in temperature and trypanosomosis attack from the breeding, just to mitigate the climate effect on livestock production. Thank you.
Thank you, Chinwe. Thank you so much.
Jackie.
There's a question for Ivan. Ivan, they said here the recent surge of desert locusts is worsened by the climate change is not news. That what is Africa doing to curb this effect that is already causing effects on food security in Africa?
Yeah, well, the recent invasion of desert locusts can certainly be linked to climate change. I mean, and if you can think about how the invasion actually happened, I mean, everything started basically happening in 2018 in the Arabian Peninsula. And you can imagine the Arabian Peninsula, it's the desert, and they hardly receive any rainfall. But sometime in the middle of 2018, there was a cyclone in this region. And this area that hardly receives any rainfall got between 50 to 60 millimeters of rainfall. And so that caused the population of the desert locusts that are normally in this area, which is the recession area, to actually start increasing in size. And strangely enough, towards the end of the year as well, around October, November, there was another cyclone, again in the Arabian Peninsula, an area that had received any rainfall. That was, I think, a cyclone Luban or something like that. And again, this caused the population that had initially grown to even keep on increasing. So as locusts have more food, the population keeps on increasing. And then again in December, around November, December of 2019, there was another cyclone in the Horn of Africa, in Somalia, and these other countries, which are also normally dry. And by this time, the population had grown, and the locusts had moved from the Arabian Peninsula to the Horn of Africa. And a population that had started from around 20 million, for instance, was up to 3.2 billion population. And this is what is now devastating East Africa to date. And countries, of course, the situation came at a time when there was, the COVID crisis also hit. So countries, of course, were now hit with a drought strategy in the middle of a pandemic. They also had the plague of the desert locust. So this has been quite a challenging situation for African countries that have been afflicted to deal with. The thing with the desert locust is that when it comes to management, especially when you're dealing with these large swarms, there are limited methods you can use apart from aerial sprays. You need aircrafts to fly and spray, these locusts and, of course, eliminate them to the greatest extent possible. But of course, the aircraft alone are not enough. You need to complement that with, and countries are doing that, complementing that with vehicle-mounted sprayers as well as handheld sprayers. But also from the Kabi perspective, we also believe that, sustainable control, and given the fact that when you use pesticides to control locusts, you're not only killing locusts, but also affecting the biodiversity. And of course, when you add up the climate change scenario into all this, it makes, of course, the systems, the agriculture system not resilient enough. And so we're looking now going into an angle of using biopesticides. Kabi has developed a product called Green Muscle. It's a biopesticide that's based on a fungus called Metarhizium acridum. And the new way we're thinking now is to ensure sustainable control by spraying now with biopesticide. And the key thing with biopesticide is that it may not kill immediately, but as the locusts keep on swarming and interacting with one another, they keep on spreading the fungus to one another, and over time, it will result into a more sustainable control of desert locust, of course, taking all this within the rules of climate change. So certainly, African countries need to think about complementing both the chemical sprays that they're currently deploying with more sustainable measures that are more climate friendly and resilient, such as use of biopesticides.
Okay, thank you, Alvan. Praise, Ben has a question for you. Ben?
Thanks, Jackie. We have a question here from the floor for Praise. It's to do with the clusters that you mentioned. Are they a formalized structure, or is that just neighbors working together? How's that working? Perhaps we don't have Praise anymore. Is he there?
Hello, Praise.
He's gone. He's gone. Okay, unfortunately, it seems that Praise has gone. Back to you, Jackie.
So at this moment, we do not have any more questions. The questions that already came is for Praise as well. So I think we're having some network issues, and it's also on transit. So at this moment, I think we're coming to the end of our session.
I have a question.
Have a question?
There's one question for Ivan as well about the private sector involvement. Can he perhaps explain a bit more about what kind of companies that he's referring to and how that would actually work?
Yes, when it comes to private sector engagement, when it comes to invasive species management, I could best answer this by giving some examples of how we've done this in Kenya, working with private sector companies to deal with invasive species. Now, we do know, and based on Kabi's work, we are trying to, our approach is to take farmers away from using pesticides. When Folamwam, and I'll use Folamwam as a classic example. The French Folamwam came to Africa and invaded a whole host of countries. Of course, the approach that farmers had at that time was to use pesticides. And we did a study that found that farmers were using lots of what are sometimes highly toxic pesticides, sometimes the class 1A, 1B, and class 2 pesticides that are both highly and moderately hazardous. And we think in the long term, this is going to affect biodiversity and the ecosystem. And of course, even make the environment less resilient to climate change. And so we've been encouraging companies or private sector companies that have products that are not based on pesticides, and basically looking at more of the lower risk products, such as biopesticides and bioerosionals, to get onto the market with their products and work together with Kabi to promote the use of these products among farmers. And so we've worked with 2 companies in Kenya. One of the companies is a company called Agbitech. And Agbitech has a product that is a baculovirus that can be used for management of fallen worm. And we've been working with them in terms of trying to get their product registered in the country, but also training farmers on how to use such products for management of fallen worm. So the company saw the value in this approach, and it has been a very close partnership where we are now close to getting registration for the product. And working with farmers, we are now developing an approach that we call area-wide management, where we're encouraging a lot of the farmers to access the product and use it to control fall armyworm. And as a result, they can control the pest without having to use pesticides. And the company also benefits to the extent that they can have market for their product and get more farmers to use it and subsequently scale out the product. And over time, this, of course, will reduce the cost of the product and more farmers can afford. So that's one example. And another one is another company called Provivi, who have a product for mating disruption. Of course, product which, of course, it prevents the males from mating the female fallen worms. They will not mate, so the eggs that are not fertile, and subsequently the population, of course, will go down. And so again, we interested this company to also get onto the market because their product is not reliant on pesticides. It's a use of a technology that is lower risk. And of course, working with a company, again, we have been working with them to have the product registered, but also working with farmers and communities to train them about how they could use such a product for managing fallen worm, and either reduce how many sprays they are applying on their maize against the pest, or completely eliminate the use of pesticides. And again, KBC sees value in this because we, through our work, we ensure that less and less farmers are using pesticides and using more and more of the lower risk products and conserving biodiversity and the environment and human health. And from the company side, they also see value in the approach because they get to bring their product on the market. They get to ensure that more farmers can now start using it. And as more farmers use it and they get to, to the volumes that make economic sense, the price can also go down and, of course, ensure that more farmers are using the product. So it's a win-win for both private sector and public sector and organizations like KABI to work with farmers in such approaches. And I think that should be the kind of model we should be pushing with the private sector to see value in how some of the technologies that they have can contribute to managing invasive species, but also add value to their business side that they want to pursue and make, of course, that commercial side so they can also make profit along the way.
Thanks, Ivan. Thank you. I see Praise is back. Praise, we have one question from the floor for you, and it's about the clusters that you talked about. Is that are those formalized structures, or are they just very informal of neighbors working together? Could you explain a bit about how that's working?
Okay. Thank you for the question. When Chinwe spoke about insurance, Nigeria has a body called MISAL that manages the risks and insurance of farmers. Now, before you have access to any funding, any level of funding from MISAL, you have to be a member of the cooperative. And so it has been institutionalized that individuals can hardly get access to these kind of privileges except they are in groups or clusters. And so because of this, even when donor-funded projects come into Nigeria, they have also adopted this model because it is working and it's easy to check people. Because when you give just individuals, it is very difficult to get the impact of what they're doing and also to manage. But when they work in groups, it's easy to save on a lot of things and time. And then at the end of the day, the yield is usually very high. Thank you.
Thanks, Praise. And perhaps over to you, Jackie, for final remarks.
Thank you, everyone, for attending our session. Thank you to Praise, Alvan, and Tiwin. This was quite informative, and I hope it was informative for you too, and you got one or two lessons and ideas from our presentations. And we are also open to more questions outside of this. If you have those before before the end of the conference, Ben is on site as well, and we have people that you can also go to meeting for one or two instances, or if you need to speak to us or one of the speakers, you can easily contact us. I hope you really enjoyed that session. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, Jackie. And so thank you very much for attending. And as a reminder, this session was organised by SciDevNet. We are the world's only news service focused on science from the developing world. So check us out, www.scidev.net. Thanks very much.